Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Yağmur Civan Uyanık, and I am the Administrative Assistant at Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar meeting. For this month's talk, titled A Book Talk, A Companion to Early Modern Istanbul, we are hosting Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, former ANAMED Fellow Shirine Hamadeh, Aleksandar Shopov, and current Senior ANAMED Fellow Leyla Kayhan Elbirlik. The talk will be moderated by former ANAMED Fellow Derin Terzioğlu, who is an associate professor at the Department of History, Boğaziçi University, and works on early modern Ottoman religious, cultural, and intellectual history. She is the co-editor of Historicizing Sunni Islam in the Ottoman Empire, C.1450 and C.7020, and Entangled Confessionizations, Theologic Perspectives on the Politics of Piety and Community Building in the Ottoman Empire, 15th and 18th centuries. A Q&A session will follow the talk. You are more than welcome to write your questions into the Q&A button throughout the event. I also would like to inform you that the microphones and videos of all attendees are turned off automatically and that this event is being recorded. Have a wonderful talk.
Good evening, or good afternoon, or good day. I'm not sure in which time zone everyone is. Alexander for sure is in a different time zone. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to today's book talk featuring a companion to early modern Istanbul. Here it is. Which has been edited by Shirine Hamadeh and Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, and which has come out of Brill's Companions to Early Modern European History just this year. My name is Derin Terzioğlu, and I'm joining you from Istanbul, where I am based at Boğaziçi University. It's my great pleasure today to act as moderator and to initiate the discussion with our four speakers. Without further ado, let me then introduce our speakers. I'll begin with Shirine Hamadeh. I assume everyone can see the names, yes. Shirine Hamadeh is, as noted, a former ANAMED Fellow and Associate Professor in the Department of Archaeology and the History of Art at Koç University. She works on the architecture and urban culture of early modern Istanbul and is the author of The City's Pleasures, Istanbul in the 18th Century. The other editor of the book is Çiğdem Kafescioğlu. She is a professor in the history department at Boğaziçi University. And she works on the visual, urban, and architectural culture of the early modern Ottoman world, and is the author of Constantinopolis / Istanbul, Cultural Encounter, Imperial Vision, and the construction of the Ottoman capital. So we also have two contributors to the book. One of them, Leyla Kayhan Elbirlik, is also, as noted, a current senior ANAMED research fellow. And she works as assistant professor at Özyeğin University in Istanbul, and her research focuses on Ottoman family history, women and gender, legal history, and the history of children and childhood. Yet another former ANAMED Fellow, Aleksandar Shopov, is assistant professor of history at SUNY Binghamton University. He specializes in the history of science and the social and environmental histories of the Ottoman Empire. He focuses on the period 1400 to 1800 and is currently writing a book on urban produce gardening in Ottoman Istanbul. So welcome all of you, and thank you for being with us today to share your thoughts about this great collaborative work you have produced. So before I direct my questions, allow me, first of all, to congratulate you for your contributions to this important and timely book. Istanbul's history has, of course, been the subject of many studies, many important studies, some of them popular, some of them academic, some of them monographic, and others encyclopedic. But I believe yours is the first collaborative work to be devoted to examine early modern Istanbul, Istanbul from the mid-15th to the early 19th century, from many different disciplinary perspectives. It is also the first book to be devoted to an Ottoman city, to come out of Brill's Companions to Early Modern European History series, which I find interesting. So I wanted to begin by asking the editors of the book, perhaps Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, if she'd like to take up this question, to first share with us the story of how you came to embark on this project. Were you contacted by Brill, or did you go to Brill with this project? How did it come about? Just it would be nice to hear a few words about the process of it. Thank you.
Sure, and yeah, thank you, Derin, for the introduction. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our authors, our two authors here, and all our authors who contributed to the volume. It was a long process of a lot of back and forths, and we were talking about, whose patience we might have tried more during the years. So we remain grateful to them. How did the book come about? We were approached separately, Shirine and I, by Brill, to edit a volume on Istanbul to be part of the series that Derin, you just mentioned, the early modern European history series, which had already published a number of volumes on cities. So they had, a volume on Rome, Naples, Turin, Buda, others were in the making, and so on. So we separately thought it would be great to embark on this project together. So we basically found each other, which wasn't difficult. We saw the potential, I think this offered to introduce Istanbul's early modern history to this European framework, to incite a sort of observation of local developments, both within and also in relation to a broader geography. And this was in a way an opportunity to look at early modern urbanity through an Istanbulite lens, to treat Istanbul as a kind of a viewing spot, a kind of nazargah, we may say, to observe local phenomena as part of a larger geography. I should also say that what also encouraged us to start this, to imagine this, was that a considerable body of scholarship had come out in the past couple of decades across disciplines that addressed questions of early modernity in Istanbul, either directly or indirectly, through different lenses. So it seemed to be a good time and a good opportunity to bring all this new research together to see how the various pieces of it would fit together. How would this work be brought together to bear on other aspects of it? Ultimately, to spotlight Istanbul as a key site of early modern urbanity. So that was from the start one of the promises of the project for us. And that in itself presented a kind of a major challenge. Istanbul obviously was this metropolis and the capital of empire. So one of the questions posed by this framework was how to bring together without letting the imperial capital, this political center of empire, overwhelm the city and its denizens, how to bring all this work together, how to bring the different aspects of urban history together. It's a question of balancing out this very powerful presence of the court and of the state institutions in all sorts of ways, from governance to legal practices to interventions of into urban space, in relation to this emerging, bustling urban population and its new urban practices. And that question, in a way, kind of led us to the structure of the book, which we know we may comment further on. A couple of other points maybe on, how this came together and how this came together in the shape it did. Some in the audience may know that our individual work, Shirine and I, as urban and architectural historians of Istanbul, started out roughly bracketing what has been more or less conventionally accepted as the ends of the early modern era. Shirine's in the 18th century, mine in the late 15th century. That time difference, I think, proved to be kind of an enriching experience to work together, and also an opportunity to test our differing perspectives on the period. And beyond our own work, we thought of this, of course, as a collective effort, a team project, where authors, through these multiple perspectives, on different spots, perhaps, of this bracketed period of the 15th, 18th centuries, would address and explore these different facets and layers of a set of historical dynamics that kind of justifies setting it apart as the early modern era. And for both of us, within that, the urban structures, the urban culture, modes of urbanity have been central to the formulations of the early modern, and that again was one of the ways in which we initially thought about the volume. Let me say that much on how this came about, and we can continue with other aspects of this.
Thank you. You already went into various directions that I was thinking of asking about, but we can continue the discussion perhaps. So I'd like to ask Shirine, to talk a little bit more about how important early modernity was for you as editors in the way you conceptualize the book. And I'm also thinking of recent debates on the usefulness, meaningfulness of this term of periodization. I'm curious as to where you situate the book in this regard. Also, I'm curious whether you asked the contributors to specifically address the question of early modernity of Ottoman Istanbul from the 15th to the beginning of the 19th century. So.
Well, thank you, Derin. Yeah, first of all, thank you for moderating this panel. Thank you to all the authors and Aleksandar and Leyla. And thank you, ANAMED, for inviting us for this book talk. I think I'll take the question from the end, beginning with whether we asked the contributors to specifically address the question of early modernity from the 15th through the early 19th century. I don't know what they think, but I think we were very careful to not impose a particular vision of early modernity or ask the author to, like for a forced reflection kind of on the conceptual notion in relation, of course, to their topics and chapters, but rather to simply take the book as an opportunity to engage with important historical developments that occurred within this time span. So if for some authors, the early modern ended in 1926 or the, not 1926, no, that would be impossible, 1826 or the 1840s, and for others, it was best brought out in a few decades or in a century, depending on their vantage points, depending on their areas of investigation. That was totally fine. I mean, this was really a time span that we opened for investigation. If I want to put it differently, I would say that what has interested us both all along in our separate works and again in this book was the conjunction of historical developments that occurred within this span of time and their cumulative significance. So we wanted this book really to create a space that would allow for reflection on early modern historical developments in their own right, and privilege that and give legitimacy to historical processes in and by themselves, not so much to question the validity of these developments, and that, you know, has been a part of a more recent debate, like how valid is this notion, how valid is it as a conceptual tool, or how valid are even these developments that we see in the long run, or whether these developments are heading straight to the modern, reading here the European modern, if we looked at them from a teleological perspective. So these are things that we deliberately did not want to engage in the abstract, let's say. On the other hand, many of the historical developments that we were interested in had already been identified by a number of scholars, like Çiğdem said earlier. They had been quite, or by the time we started working on this book, there had already been quite a hefty body of scholarship on the topic. One key point, for example, is that urbanization itself was key to early modern developments, with all that it engendered in terms of demographic growth and migration, new urban experiences, new urban spaces, new social types. In the case of Istanbul, it was central to processes of state building, commercialization, capital formation, some forms of privatization, to the city's increasing interconnectedness with the world, to the more globalized trade, the way in which knowledge circulated or changes in the circulation of knowledge, to the changes we observe in the public and political presence of urbanites and their involvement in the transformation of the material environment, and so on. So the way we conceptualize the book, meaning its parts and chapters and general topics, was very much informed by developments that had been identified in relation specifically to the early modern context. For example, we opened the volume with chapters on the city folks, not with what is conventionally the more privileged beginning of a volume, which would be the palace folks. And that is because we recognized, because there was already a lot of very interesting evidence that their presence and engagement in the public arena was a significant feature of the early modern city. Or, for example, instead of the more, again, conventional book structure that would have the state, the court, palace, society in discrete chapters, we really wanted to put forth the interface between those, between palace and city, which again, evidence showed was characteristic of this time. And so many chapters in the volume, be they on the political elite, on artistic production, on ceremonial, on the infrastructure, underscore precisely this dynamics. So in a way, early modernity was very integral to the way we even constructed the book.
Thank you. So I'll basically continue to the next adjective. And I would like to ask Çiğdem, what does it mean to write about Istanbul from the 15th through the 18th century as part of not just early modern, but early modern European history? What were some of the shared patterns and interconnections between early modern Istanbul and other early modern European cities? What might be also some of the alternative cultural geographies against which we might examine Ottoman Istanbul profitably? And to what extent and in what ways did these broader cultural geographies, be it the European or the Mediterranean, or if you like, Black Sea, inform the different contributions in your volume?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question, Derin. And maybe there is a bit of an irony I might start as an answer to that question in placing Istanbul in the series on early modern European history, both in view of the scholarship, but maybe also in view of the vicissitudes of Turkey's relation to Europe, particularly lately. So that might be something to talk about separately, perhaps. But the first kind of irony, the irony that stems from the scholarship, maybe we can call this a productive kind of situation. This paradigmatic distinction put forth by Max Weber, for example, between European and non-European cities, particularly in his case between European and Islamic cities, as we all know, has been a quite persistent one. And this paradigm of the Islamic city within which Istanbul has sometimes been kind of situated, located in scholarship has been, as also we know, been continuously problematized, continuously questioned. New work highlights some of the commonalities across the European, non-European, or the European non-Western divide, looking at, comparable modes of governance, of state and society dynamics, on certain economic and commercial patterns, at the mobility of individuals and ideas, through which some of these boundaries are broken down, the circulation of material culture and goods, and so on. But regardless, in some ways, this polarity is still with us and still within European scholarship on urban history. And we all know that these civilizational, larger geographic distinctions are tenacious and not easily shaken. So very shortly, I think the most immediate implication of placing the volume in a series of European history is calling attention both to the tenaciousness of our academic and intellectual boundary makers, and also to what exists beyond those boundaries once we start looking, once we start doing the historical work, doing historians' work. But beyond that, of course, beyond this issue of you know, where the book is placed, and you know, in what ways it is connected to European history, to world history, a number of shared patterns and interconnections between Istanbul, between early modern Istanbul and other European cities can be identified. Some of these Shirine already pointed out. Now I can just kind of identify a number of shifts. So not really finding identical developments, but a number of parallel shifts that took place in this period, or at different junctures of this larger period, in for example, in the structure of urban institutions, in forms of association, in forms of urban experience as they were shaped by political frameworks, by legal, by cultural frameworks. The issue of urbanization, the growth of urban populations, interventions into urban space. That is, again, a very kind of parallel set of developments and shifts, transformations of urban space at a number of different registers. These may be very expansive citywide projects and monumental expressions, but at the same time, emerging property relations and land use patterns, changing relationship between city and hinterland, both immediate hinterlands and broader hinterlands, that we observe across Eurasian geographies in different localities. Another aspect of this is forms and expressions of urbanity, and that is something that comes out, I think, quite visibly in the volume. Newly emerging modes of urban experience, newly emerging modes of identity and belonging that is connected to the city. Changing forms of public and political presence on the urban arena. That too is to my mind one of the very, you know, powerful points of parallelism. So you know, one may expand these, and also let me note here that this you know, these different aspects of what we may identify as dimensions of early modern city making, urbanity, are not really a kind of a checklist that was on our minds, you know, early modern this, yes, here too, early modern that, yes, here too. Rather, these were issues that had to be explored, that had to be dug into in order to bring out, you know, whether our initial perspectives on parallelisms, on connections, on comparison are viable or not. So hopefully there is that space opened up, or there's a contribution to the space opened up for this kind of work. Alternative geographies, you said, two obvious geographies come to my mind, related. One is the work that has come out on major cities of the Ottoman realm, again within the same time period, right? The work on Aleppo, on Damascus, on Cairo, Sarajevo, in different regards on cities like Ankara and Bursa. And I think we haven't really yet fully done the work of looking at the larger picture that may emerge out of this work on urban histories of the early modern era within the Ottoman geography, for its connections, for its any shared patterns, for its divergences too. The other would be the urban worlds of the Islamic empires, the Safavid and the Mughal empires. And this too is an area, a larger geography that has seen some really exciting developments in the scholarship recently. What come to my mind is cities like Isfahan and Delhi and Agra, and this issue of the imperial capital or versus the metropolis, again, comes up with the possibilities of this kind of work. But I think there are really possibilities of good work coming out of that framework as well. How and to what extent these broader cultural geographies informed the contributions to the volume? They come up. Japan to Russia to different parts of Europe. These come up. These geographies come up having to do with urban literature, with political movements, uprisings, expressions of dissent, with material culture and other things. They emerge as points of connection. Sometimes they emerge as points of comparison in the different chapters of the volume. But in relation to this, I should also, I think, note that doing full justice to these connections and to the possibilities of comparative history that are embedded here would require a different kind of work, would I think require a different kind of volume, because inevitably, a volume on Istanbul within a series with, set, number of pages, word counts for chapters, which was a big issue for our authors and us too, obviously, had its limitations. So I think a different framing for exploring the global and exploring the possibilities of comparative work and connected histories is still there and would be wonderful to get to. I think, well, in response to, I think, your set of questions, these may be some of the answers.
Thank you. That was actually quite rich. Thank you. So, Shirine, if I may ask you another question, this time about the multidisciplinary character of the book. It strikes me, and I'm sure it struck many of your readers as well, that you are both the two editors of the book. You are both architectural and urban historians. That your research interests and the focus of your publications lie mainly in Ottoman urban and architectural history. Yet, as everyone who's looked through this collective volume will attest, that a companion to early modern Ottoman Istanbul contains essays that span a wide range of topics from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives. Social history is obviously very strongly represented, but so are new fields or subfields such as environmental history. In fact, it's striking that so many of the contributions themselves, so many of the essays themselves straddle multiple disciplinary approaches. and pay attention to both the city's physical, material, spatial layout and its social, cultural, economic patterns. So is this accidental or was it planned? Could you speak a bit more about how you envision the disciplinary or multidisciplinary scope of the book and how you put it into practice?
Thanks, Derin. Again, I'm going to start this time from the middle, maybe picking on one item, which was the attention to space and materiality that you noted, and then move on, and maybe the multidisciplinary aspect of the book will become more. I mean, the way it all became the way it became will become more evident. So maybe I should start by saying that, as you said, both Çiğdem and I are architectural and urban historians, and for both of us, spatiality is a very important, space is a very important consideration, or let's say we do give a lot of attention to space and the material environment, but not as inquiries distinct from other kinds of historical developments. So in working, in looking, really doing the work on architectural history, on a particular architectural history or urban history, there are inevitably, and I want to say almost naturally, other fields of inquiry that come into the picture and that become integral to the way that one looks at this urban history or even architecture or buildings history. Essentially, the fact that the city spaces and its material environment are not simply backdrops onto which social, economic, political, cultural, whatever developments unfold, but actually integral constituents of these developments, is very much part of an approach that we have integrated, I guess, a very long time ago, that we believe in very strongly. So that's one thing, but you know, it's not simply a matter of methodology. And I think, you know, there are interesting echoes here, because this approach also resonates very strongly with something quite characteristic of the time period that the book considers. And that is that we see, and more, what Çiğdem noted a little earlier as new types of interventions into urban space. And that is really a feature of many early modern cities. We basically see an urban environment getting shaped and getting radically transformed physically through the participation of larger, more diverse groups of peoples and communities. And again, more and more carrying the imprint of new forms of involvement with the city, both on the part of the court, the central state apparatus, and of a variety of groups of denizens. And all this makes it imperative to try, at least as best we can, to situate these actors and the topics at hand within the spaces and the materiality of the city. So there are historical and methodological considerations here that very much echo one another. And so in a certain way, I want to say that the multidisciplinary thinking that is, as you said, integral to the book is almost a natural result of both the kinds of historical phenomena or developments that we perceive in the course occurring in the course of these centuries, and also very much a result of our approach to urban history, which this book really is. I mean, urban history is not simply about the history of the physical development or the physical fabric of a city. So it was natural that we wanted to have the volume grounded, so to say, in the urban space, to the extent that it's relevant, of course, but to integrate and to think of the city's materiality, be it its topography or its buildings or its streets or waters or gardens, in relation to topics and questions that don't usually seem to necessitate such considerations. And I think this is work that has, that I think Çiğdem will agree with me, that has not been sufficiently done perhaps in the scholarship, and would really necessitate being taken more seriously. So you will see in the volume, for example, that this physical fabric of the city is not something isolated in a separate chapter or in a separate section, let's say on architecture or on the urban physical developments, as it is usually the case in large edited volumes. But instead, the city's spatial and material dimensions run across the book, whether in discussions on trade, on intercommunal relations, on family life, as we see in Leyla's chapter, on masculinity, on literature, on music, on agriculture, again, as we see, for example, in Aleksandar's chapter, ceremonial, on natural catastrophes, revolts, topics that have been already mentioned by Çiğdem. So, okay, maybe I'll stop here and leave some time for other questions.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like now to turn to Leyla, if I may. I would just like to begin by asking you to, briefly, sum up, at least give us some idea, not sum up, that would be probably not feasible. Give some idea of the main topic of your essay on neighborhoods and family lives in Istanbul, and maybe in the interest of time, if I may, also add a more specific question. I mean, the topic that you deal with is a very well-known and important topic of social history, right? Social legal, but at the same time. Because of this emphasis that I see in the book on kind of combining the social, economic, cultural, if you like, with the material, physical, I would be curious to hear your thoughts about how important that dimension was to the way you dealt with your topic. Yeah. And maybe it's too much to add, so ignore it if you like. But I know you've been working on family history, neighborhood and family history in Istanbul in late 18th century, early 19th century Istanbul, and of course this is still a new topic in Ottoman studies. So I don't know whether it's realistic of me to even pose this question, but I'm wondering whether you have some sense of how unique Istanbul was in this regard. Yeah.
Thank you, Derin. Wow, this is a tough question with the ending, especially.
Ignore it if you wish.
No, I think it's a very important question that one should consider, especially writing a book now on the topic. So thank you. Well, my chapter, as you said, on neighborhood and family lives actually focuses on the neighborhood as a tight-knit, collective urban entity that embodied a common culture, generating as well a sheltering network for its residents. And the first part of the chapter actually focuses on the materialization and population of the early modern mahalle, and the inhabitants' use and regard of public and communal space. So actually spatiality and materiality really enters into my text in the first part. And in a way, as you said, it's a very difficult topic to work on because a lot has been said on it in a way. But at the same time, when I was writing this chapter, I really had a difficult time defining what it means to look at the early modern Istanbul mahalle, because it's very permeable, because of the way the identities are really fluid in a specific mahalle, but at the same time, it shapes and generates identities of its own. In other words, the idea of loyalty and belonging comes into place when one is thinking about the court records, which are the primary sources that I rely on. Since there are no, surnames used at this period, of course, one is really differentiated and distinguished by their anchorage into a mahalle or by not belonging to a mahalle. It's an identifier and signifier in this period. And of course, I focus on the later period of 18th century in my own research, but of course, in the context of this book, I was looking at a longer period, and I tried to focus on what this fluidity meant in terms of visibility, because I also focus on gender. For the purposes of time, I'm not gonna, go step by step on what I do in the chapter, but marriage and marriage's contractual basis, actually, I find a lot of similarities with the way that is constructed and the way neighborhoods are formulated or structured. So in terms of looking at the family and neighborhood, both institutions form certain let's say property related associations. They both generate knowledge, and this knowledge production actually creates certain solidarities within the neighborhood and within the family, and also between the neighborhood and the family. So there's this constant ongoing flourishing, very organic relationship that I find to be really suitable for this book as a chapter. That might be bringing something new. That was my hope, at least. And in terms of how unique Istanbul was, well, when we look at, for example, if we look at Sofia during the same time in the early modern period, a lot of court records from Sofia actually include marriage contracts, the akd nikah. But in Istanbul, you don't get to see any of that. This is really interesting. I mean, I really looked, trust me. And the fact that it's missing actually says something. But at the same time, in this period, in the 18th century, for example, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, I came across, just by sampling, actually, it was luck, really, the records of Davut Pasha court. And here there was an accumulation of family-related, divorce-related court cases within the span of 100 years. Not even, you cannot really say, oh, because the judge there, it had to do with the naib or the qadi being easy on certain types of divorce or not. No, this wasn't the case. It lasted for a duration. So I think there's this, in terms of divorce, divorce happens outside of the court. But the fact that there's a rise in the registry of divorce cases, there's a rise in the registration of property-related cases between the conjugal couple, and these registrations being done by women, almost 90% of the time, says something unique about Istanbul, I think. Perhaps it was easier to build a know-how about the court culture. Perhaps there was an outward opening of some sorts of the domestic life. And in a way, the neighborhoods, this tight-knit structure of the neighborhoods and the permeability between the neighborhoods allowed for this knowledge to echo in a way, so that different, I guess, women, I focus on women specifically here, heard of each other's struggles and actually found an escape from that situation by making use of the court, because it was more accessible, let's say, in comparison to other parts of the empire. And also in terms of the access to property or the right to property ownership, I think not just Istanbul, but the Ottoman case is unique in comparison to Europe. Because women had the right to own property outside of marriage and in marriage. So they didn't have to give up their right or carry on their property from their own families or property that they inherited during marriage and give it directly to their husbands. That wasn't the case. Of course, legally that wasn't the case, but in actuality, there were problems in terms of owning up to it. But of course, there was also, we see women really trying to struggle and make a fight for containing their contractual rights, let's say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Aleksandar, thank you for waiting. I actually would like to direct pretty much the same question that I directed to Leyla. Could you introduce to our listeners, the main concerns of your chapter, your essay, and also talk about how you navigated, the spatial, material, environmental, physical aspects of the topic that you were investigating. It's quite strong in that case, and then also the social economic relations that, of course, were also very important for the story that you told.
Thank you so much for the question, and also thanks to ANAMED for hosting this. this event. So I'll start with the title of the article. The title is "When Istanbul Was a City of Bostans, Urban Agriculture and Agriculturalists," and here we had a back and forth about the title, whether I think one other contributor had a similar title. It was like, I'm not maybe Selim Kuru but I really insisted on having this title to just showing to show that first of all, using the word of Bostan, and this would this is really important, because if today Istanbul is not maybe associated with Bostan, in the early modern period, it was really urbanized. People living in the city really had a clear understanding and of where these agricultural spaces are located in the city. For example, Langa, especially the Langa Bostans, which were destroyed in the 20th century, you have divan poetry discussing or mentioning the Langa Bostans and mentioning the produce of the Langa Bostans, which were the famous Langa cucumbers. So this is something actually it's interesting, because it's the early modernity, the early modern period of Istanbul, and sort of the modern period and the modern history of the city are in that sense connected, because even though the Bostans of the city today, most of the Bostans that existed in the early modern period are destroyed, in the kind of popular understanding of the city even today, these places are invoked. These places are frequently mentioned. They're used actually to show that someone knows about the city and someone belongs to the city, and would invoke, like the Langa cucumbers, the Yerikole lettuce. And so we see how strong is this agricultural identity in this even today in the city. It's just like, even if those spaces were erased in the 20th century, it still exists. Like, these spaces still exist in the imagination of the people today. And this is something that I don't know, I would say maybe it's a kind of resistance on the part of Istanbulites today in the past decades to this, I would say, to the very much, I would say, antagonistic division of labor between town and county that exists in this modern world, or the capitalist modernity. So that distinction is really enforced, and not only in Istanbul, but in many of the urban centers across the world, where really agriculture is being erased, is being destroyed, and many of these historic spaces that historically have been producing food for the city are destroyed. So my article unfortunately doesn't talk about these issues, but I try to of the 20th century Bostan, and I hope that I can have an opportunity to refer to this in the future. But I'm trying. My main focus in the article is to discuss why and how agricultural land in the city, with its soil, became a commodity. Basically, how was possible for soil in the city to be incorporated into the things that matter, the things that are valued, the things that are exchanged on the market, inherited. And here, maybe my article and in general my research on the Bostans of Istanbul is kind of like maybe a response to this scholarship that treats Istanbul as the imperial center. This is something. It was really important Çiğdem Kafescioğlu mentioned that sometimes I think frequently there's that danger that Istanbul is the emphasis on Istanbul as the imperial center overwhelms kind of and trumps over like these complexities of the city. So this scholarship, and it's still I think it's people writing this way, just to describe, you know, like Egypt or Iraq or, you know, the countryside, different countryside as a city as agricultural productive, and Istanbul as kind of as the imperial center, managing these you know, tax this flow of materials and goods, and also taxing the surplus. But so I approached this so the bostans by and the agricultural space in the city by, you know, by focusing on first the imperial ideology in the decades following the conquest. I think the creation of agricultural spaces, as I argue in the article, is related to, it's kind of an answer to the criticism of the anti-centralization factions that emerged following the conquest that preferred Edirne as the capital. And some of these narratives, of course, oppose the transformation of Istanbul into a capital and describe the city as agriculturally barren, that it cannot produce. Another focus of the article is the history of renting and lease contracts, where I really wanted to show how bostans played a role in the early privatization of land in this period under discussion. So the emergence of capital and labor-intensive agriculture in the city was also, I tried to show, was complementary to the intensification of the migration from the countryside at the end of the 16th century, but this goes on and throughout the 17th and the 18th century. So I try to create a more balanced picture of like maybe of how and why things become valuable and exchanged on the market, not only by focusing on the labor, because it is very important, you know, just that the labor of those migrants really created the spaces, but also there is an interplay of, as I said, of the, you know, this imperial ideology, the debates in the Ottoman society about centralization, but also floods, fires. You know, many of these bostans that employed, you know, thousands of people in the city, you know, were created in flood-prone regions in the city, especially the Valley of Likos, or the Valley of Bayrampaşa, but also on the other side in Yedikule, that's part of another valley. Fires, also briefly talk about the role of bostans in fire mitigation. So because they're really centered on the roots of fires, and we have some records of people using the bostans as a refuge for fire. So I try to create this balance between, you know, what someone would say would be like a classical Marxist approach, thinking about labor and how labor is related to, you know, to sort of capital accumulation, but then thinking about this also spatial, really important spatial and environmental issues as well. Sorry, maybe I took too long, but and I missed some of your one of or two of your questions. You asked several of them.
Sorry, now I'm not muted, right? You hear me? Yes, I have hay fever, so occasionally I have to sneeze. So if maybe I actually continue with you, Aleksandar, and then turn to Leyla, just so there's a little bit of continuity with what you started. I wanted to ask about how you dealt with change over time. You touched upon it a bit, but I'm still curious to know what were the constants or relative constants of the entire early modern period as a whole, as far as your topic was concerned, and what were some of the broader changes that you detected?
Yes, thank you. Some of the constants. That's a very important question. I think, and this does not go only for the early modern period, but also for the history of modern Istanbul. It's rents, and in the early modern period, and today, people are struggling with rents, and I think this is one of the characteristics of maybe modernity in general, that it is and the property relationships and rents. And I put an emphasis on this in my article, and I talk about the development of new types of lease contracts towards the end of the 16th and the 17th century. And in the case of the Bostans, and how the emergence of these new types of lease contracts allowed for urbanites to accumulate land in the city and outside the city as well. That's a very important development. And I start the story from kind of the 15th century, where I show that the lease contracts were short term when leasing the land. And they evolve into something else. And this is really important, because if you by following the lease contracts, you can see first, yes, this accumulation of property of urbanites in the city, but also different types of urbanites. Both Christians and Muslims, also women. These long-term lease contracts, double lease contracts, actually allowed for women to inherit these properties. So that's a big change. And this is, in the 17th century, we see that these contracts are inherited by women. To go back to Leila's article, which is, I think it's, in a way, we are connected. Our work is connected in that sense. But so the lease contracts is something that I try to provide a long-term, long-durée history of these contracts in the city, and how is that related to the agricultural land, and another. So that would be a constant, but that would be some of those changes, important changes that happen to the landscape and to the ability of urbanites to accumulate property. In terms of constant, I think that these environmental or the factors are presenting to us, or there is a constant there, in a way that the floods were an issue for throughout this periods, and what I believe one of the reasons why these Bostans existed all the way to the 20th century was actually floods. That the presence of this danger for floods and this agricultural land was predominantly located on these flood plains, and fires as well. And fires is connected with wind, of course, because Istanbul has its own winds, and that determines the path of fire. So there's that continuity and change when it comes to some of these social institutions and environmental factors, and this was also the Bostans were also a response to all of this. As I said, in terms of fires, they frequently they used as fire breaks, and the question of the materiality of, of the construction of buildings, the types of buildings that were constructed in the city, the types of answers to these to earthquakes and fires is something that exists in many of the contributions, and I think it's one of the first ones if you open the volume, is that of Professor Gürül Necipol, and she really goes into very important questions of that importance to think about the building materials of the city and issues of fires, and so that would be my answer to your question. But thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask my possibly last question to Leyla, and then actually I'd also like to remind our listeners that I don't want to dominate the questions, so we can use the remaining time then to take some questions from the audience. So Leyla, I actually wanted to direct you the same question. I'm curious as to what were the relative constants of the early modern period for your story about neighborhoods and family life, and then also the broader patterns of change that you observed in those relations.
Thank you, Derin. So I guess it's difficult to observe change in a structure as conservative as family, because I mean, we're still getting married and giving birth to children in this day and age. So, I mean, there are certain constants that don't easily change. Family is a very conservative space in that sense. And also the neighborhood, I mean, the most intimate microcosm of the city, where one found some kind of a belonging in the vastness of this landscape. It sort of preserves one, but at the same time, it's such a controlled space that one of the constants is the neighborhood, sort of this unofficial neighborhood surveillance mechanism in which one can become a part of the neighborhood if one spends, 5 consecutive years and is allowed into that community. But at the same time, one can easily be banished from the neighborhood for moral misconduct, on the word of 5 or 6 men. So it is a constant, unfortunately, but it's also a savior at certain points, as far as we can see in the court records. It really is a helpful mechanism at times. But I guess, like Alex, I actually find Alex's work really important for what I do also, because when I first started doing my research, I remember going to the ISAM library. That's where they had the microfilm with all the court records you couldn't photocopy, and I literally sat down and drew maps of, not maps, but like layouts of all the plots of lands that they were actually talking about, that women owned, or I mean, they were a part of. And I don't know why I did this, but it just gave me a spatial sense of what actually was materializing. And I think what's changing in this period mostly is as Çiğdem said also, the new modes of property relations and patterns that are arising from that. And with that, I mean, that's what I look at in terms of family. That's what I look at. But at the same time, in the 18th century specifically, it's the first time that the state is trying to impose people getting married to obtain a permit prior to the akte, which is called izinname. And it doesn't really get it doesn't really, it's not executed really properly because there's no one really to police it at the time. I mean, it's such a loose concept, but the fact that it's trying to be imposed, I think it's a turning point in terms of people's understanding of property ownership as well. And because it officializes certain things and it makes that marital contract a visible and legitimate one in terms of the economy of marriage, I think. But also the rise in these divorce registration cases, as I said before, is also a way of seeking authorization in the same manner, maybe. The fact that people didn't have to register their divorce, but women opted to register these divorce cases, shows us that they're trying to cling on to the property that one can actually allot from being married or being divorced. So this is, I think, a change, but it doesn't happen abruptly. It doesn't happen in massive numbers, but it just, there's a shift there. I think that's really important. I don't know if that answered your question. That's one of the shifts that I see, at least.
It's nice to see the connections between your respective works as well. So that really came out nicely. Thank you. So I'd just like to remind our listeners that you can write your questions. I think that is the way to do it in the Q&A, and then I should be able to see them, but I don't. So I'll just wait for a couple of seconds. If not, I have more questions to go through, but I just didn't want to not give you a chance. Okay. We have time. So if I may then ask my last common question to the two of you, Leyla and Alex.
I think there's a question in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, oh great. Where? Oh, here. Excellent.
It's not a question.
Okay, that's nice.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's right. But there is another one. Oh, okay. Okay. But let me know if I don't notice it. But basically, I was just, curious about, actually, this is a question that I could direct to all of you, but it would be probably boring to ask everyone the same question. But I'm just curious whether any of you would like to comment on how, for instance, in the case of Leyla and Alex, how the experience of writing these book chapters impacted the way you think about your larger projects, because I know that both of you have been working on your respective topics for quite some time, and you're both preparing or have prepared whole monographs on this topic. So I'm curious about how different or challenging or rewarding an experience it was for you to write a book chapter, a chapter part of a larger volume on early Istanbul, on a topic on which you're also writing a whole book, and maybe also, comment on whether you had the chance to read others' contributions in the process of writing or editing, and whether that, if that happened, whether you found it beneficial. So Leyla, would you like to take it up first?
Sure. Yes, of course, this was a very rewarding experience for me. At the time of the writing, I didn't get to read anybody else's chapters. Had I would have actually really benefited from Alex's chapter, I think. And I have several questions for him after this panel. But in terms of my own research, what I can say can go as far as what the court records actually are showing. But after accumulating, and also inheritance deeds, of course, terekes, muhalefat. But after reading several of them, huge numbers of them, it's very difficult. I found it very difficult to go through these Excels and try to make sense of certain patterns in terms of the dower amounts. I tried to do a demographic assessment, and it was kind of impossible. And maybe it's not important, I'm not sure, but in a way I'm curious about it. So after this chapter writing, I actually turned to another way of looking at this material. And it's still in the works, but I did this analysis with Professor Murat Güvenç, as Çiğdem knows, and it really gave me another sense of the material that I have in terms of the individual's vocational practices, social, cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, ages, if it's mentioned in the text, physical appearance, where they lived, how they lived. So I'm trying to build, sort of with what I have, something that might bring out, I guess, sort of like a map of these divorce cases, or a map from the divorce cases that I'm trying to, analyze, which will be a part of my project, hopefully. So I think looking at neighborhood lives and also thinking about space and domestic space in this way really sort of ignited this. So thank you, editors.
We thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, would you like to take this up?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think some of us had the opportunity to read the contributions of, or the early versions of those contributions from other contributors. I'm not sure if I did that, but I think like the comments of the editors, they had that in their perspective, because they were looking at all those contributors. So when they were back, and I can say it was probably, we had an exchange that went on and on for a couple of years, and it's not one or two emails. We're talking about like really like 15, 20 kind of back and forth responses. So I think like in their comments, they really incorporated, they thought about all other contributions. So they really, maybe they certainly helped me and others to be in conversations with each other. And I think that they did an excellent job, a wonderful job. And how did I benefit? Yes, my project is, of course, I'm writing a book on urban agriculture of Istanbul in this period, and my article summarizes some of the things that I will argue in the book. Of course, not everything, but the participation, and it's a great honor to participate in this volume. But it is also a responsibility to engage with the scholarships of all the people, of all contributors in this volume, to really treat that seriously. It's like it's impossible just to single-handedly write about the history of the city. This is, in my view, it has to be a communal endeavor. Writing history, it has to be done in kind of communally, and not a single scholar, but just a group of scholars, and also in conversation with the people that are that live in spaces that we write about. So in that sense, I think that I will benefit so much from this volume, and this volume will continue to live. It will. I think that knowing all the contributors, it will continue to live. This conversation will continue to live, and I hope it will find, and it will definitely find space in my monograph. I hope it will come out soon.
Thank you. Great.
May I add something
Yeah, please.
to that? I had mentioned this earlier, that one of the things I kind of regret as we started in pre-pandemic days, that we didn't have the kind of workshop or meeting where everyone would share something, at least the initial thoughts of their chapters. Now thinking about it, it would be quite an easy thing to do. At the time, it felt like it would it was beyond our capabilities, our finances, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I've been thinking maybe it's obviously too late for the book itself, but I was wondering if it would be interesting for the authors to come together. Now we are four of us here, but maybe make a larger thing of that with whoever is interested, to see responses, and to see possible venues into which we might venture together, or apart, or individually, or as other groups, etc. Because I think both Shirine and I do feel that there are these connections that opened up, some of which were visible to us, some of which became visible as we were editing, so that when we felt the need or the usefulness, we shared some of the chapters, but some of it really emerged also once the whole thing came together and kind of fitted together. So it would be, at least to my mind, interesting, and maybe also fruitful in some ways, to kind of share our responses to this body of work that has come together. Just an idea.
In fact, even people who haven't been part of it would love to take part, just to hear. It sounds wonderful.
I mean, I'll just say one more sentence, that yes, I mean, absolutely. And in a way, it would be very sad to stop the project right here, because this is the first time, after all, that all the contributors, I mean, not to speak of anybody else, but all the contributors have an opportunity to read all the other contributions. So this is the moment when, I mean, it's like a stage 2 to the project, where these connections that like Çiğdem was saying, we either knew of, or we noticed along the way, or that became apparent at a much later stage, become apparent to everybody, because they're absolutely fascinating. And yes, totally. I mean, going further in the project would be fantastic to have all the contributors, and maybe non-contributors, to take part in a dialogue based on this material that was collected together. Because like Alex said, the most important thing ultimately is this, this collectivity, this communal effort, like he said, of doing things that we can't possibly do on our own. And, making sure we take these opportunities, or create more of these opportunities.
Thank you. So on that note, future-looking, kind of forward-looking note, let's end this session as we have come to the end of the time allotted to us. So thank you all for your contributions and for the contributions to this discussion. I greatly enjoyed it, and thanks to the listeners as well for being here.
I also would like to thank you so much for this impressive discussion on behalf of ANAMED, and also would like to thank our attendees.